Why do podcasts fail? This episode is going to be covering the 10 most common reasons and what you can do to avoid being part of those statistics. In case we haven't met, hi, I'm Anna. I'm the founder of the podcast space. I'm an award-winning marketing expert for podcasters, and I help you one episode at a time overcome all of those limiting beliefs and turn your podcast into the most powerful tool of your business. So let's dive right in. Something that I thought really interesting when I was kind of researching and thinking about these 10 reasons why most podcasts fail was based on obviously what I've researched online, but also my experience with working with well over 100 podcasters in 15 years of content production. And it's just so interesting to me, the reasons why podcasters will stop the show. And there are a lot of anecdotes and there are a lot of people who had really successful shows and from one day to the next, they decide to just give it all up and go into the next one. But the reality is that these 10 reasons are really common and honestly, no one is immune to them happening to them. And let's start with number one, which is most podcasts fail because the host didn't give them enough time to generate momentum and to become part of their audience's day-to-day. And honestly, this is so true, right? Like everything in life takes time and habits to form. I think they take like 90 days, or 30 days, can't recall. Anyway, a lot of days. And so podcasting is almost like a blog, right? It's not like you just launch a podcast and right away you have success. And just that understanding it takes time really helps you stick with it. If you're thinking like, I've been podcasting for 3 months, just understand that things take time is just so helpful in sticking in the game. And also sticking in the long game is letting you know that only 10% of podcasters who launch a show will make it to a full year of podcasting. And this is data that I pulled from the Actively Established Podcast Report by Raphonic and Podmatch. This is surprising, right? You may think, oh my gosh, everyone I know, I feel like they have a podcast. But if you're worried that your competitor may launch a podcast, just wait for a year and see. Most people are not going to be podcasting, or maybe they are not podcasting within the same thing that you are. So don't worry about it. I always tell them, do you. Moving into the second thing within this first one is that it takes time to create a proof of concept. Even thinking about the benefits that you're bringing to your listeners. If you're not consistent, if you're not delivering good quality content and valuable content for a longer period of time, people are almost like, when you're in a relationship and you don't know if you want to stick with them or not. Same thing with podcasting. You have to give them time to be like, okay, I like this. I dig this. I'm going to stay with it. So again, same thing for you. The audience is going to be thinking this. You need to give them time. All right, number 2, most podcasts fail because they're not investing in areas where they're needed the most. And so there's something to be said about the DIY spirit of podcasters, right? But I feel like the people that stop the show are people who are lacking the skills and they did not invest in training. They were just trying to figure it all out on YouTube or free courses, free downloadables. You're going to hit a ceiling. And so with that in mind, I think that is important to understand that if you're not having the skills, then maybe you need to hire out, right? The investment needs to be hiring out someone who can do that for you. And especially if you have a business, those are business expenses, right? For most part, check with your accountant. But the reality is that you can use these as expenses. These 3, the skills, the will, and the time, you need them in order to see traction to create a good product. But if you're trying to figure it all out constantly on these 3 elements, you're going to be losing a lot of time. You're going to be losing the will to do it. And it's going to just take time to build, and you're going to grow frustrated. And that's one of the reasons why I see people give up on their podcasts, because they're just like, oh, it takes so much time to learn all of this. When you're podcasting, you're learning about almost 8 skills. For me, this podcast, for instance, I started recording the podcast and it was daytime, and now I have my light. If you're watching this, I'm going to be having light changing. And again, I haven't mastered yet the lighting in my office for these podcasts to look slick and all that, but I'm just giving it time, right? I'm understanding that it's not that just because, again, I could record it during the day, but I have other things to do, other things to tend to. And so to me, I have to be okay with, it's going to take time for me to understand which lights are best, especially because I wear glasses. So I cannot just put any type of light in front of me. The space is not massive. I use this space as my regular office, so I need to be able to move around. It's not that I have to rooms, and one is my studio and the other one is my office. Those constraints, I would say, understanding that it's fine, and it's, again, I'm okay with it, with learning, with creating of a less, quote unquote, less than perfect content, and just being okay with the fact that it's going to take time for me to master those skills. I'm fine with that. But again, okay, it's not a final product that it looks like $1 million, but I'm giving it time. So just being aware of that really helps you not feel like just throwing these podcasts out the window because I'm spending 2 hours trying to do the setup and it's still not looking great. Again, I'm looking at myself recording this right now and I'm like, oh, it's not perfect, but it's fine. Most of you are listening on audio platforms anyway, and also I'm giving you the disclaimer right now. So the opposite of that, of not wanting to invest at all and just trying to DIY it and go for the freebies, is number 3, investing too much too soon. And at some point in my career, I worked in a podcast studio, and I would see people who would come in and they say, I'm throwing this podcast like everything I got. This is my Hail Mary to do business and be successful, whether through they were being seen online through like a very amazing studio and trying to build their authority like that. Or maybe they have been invisible for many, many years and they realized that they had to go online and create something extraordinary to be seen. A lot of these people, they were just investing so much without knowing if this was going to work out. So not investing time with something that I'm going to be talking about later is having no strategy, right? So they're maybe putting too much money in and not having enough money to operate a business, for instance. Just like, I hope some client comes through these podcasts, otherwise things are going to be going wrong. Or then investing too much time, right? Maybe it's spending hours and hours, quote unquote, perfecting. Again, I just talked about how the cameras, I'm okay with this not being the slickest setup for now. So some people say, I spent 4 hours trying to make this light setup look great, and I ended up just not posting episodes half the time because all of my energy, again, too much energy spent in little things, ended up not working out for them. They're like, I'm burned out. I don't want to do this anymore. So that is one of the reasons why most people get super disappointed and stop podcasting. Number 4, worrying too much about appealing to everyone but themselves. So it comes from some people being insecure, some people feeling like they're not comfortable being who they are as an expert because they feel like they're looking around and everyone else is more experienced. So this comes with a lot of re-recording episodes, a lot of insecurity, sometimes not even promoting the podcast because they're just so worried about creating content that will look good to everyone that they're like, oh my gosh, I forgot to say this and that or that, or I misspoke. All the time, I mention how I always forget about something, but I'm like, that is another episode that I could record down the line. So I know that I'm not worried about publishing an episode and saying, oh gosh, what will, my peers say that I didn't mention this and this, that it was so obvious. Well, maybe when I was recording, I was focused on other stuff. So again, I published that episode. Maybe it's a part 2. Maybe it's something that I do on social media. I'm not too focused on just being perfect all the time, right? So I know that I'm creating the value that you need to hear. And also the podcast is being a tool for what I needed to do. Me first, then you, right? Prioritizing is super important. But again, it's your product. It's going to be imperfect at times. Creating a podcast that you know the format at, which is almost like the third thing of this bullet point of like worrying about getting everyone's opinion heard, is just sometimes like trying to replicate the formats that you're like, oh, so-and-so is doing that format. As an expert, I should be replicating that because otherwise it's not as, important or relevant. Or maybe you say, oh, I only have maybe 6 months of experience in an industry. I don't know if I can create these podcasts because I know that there's 3 things that I didn't cover that I know that people with 1 year of experience are going to bite, quote unquote, my head off for not mentioning that. So that is honestly insecurities and worrying about The opinions of everybody else are just one of the many reasons why people stop podcasting, why podcasts fail. And then number 5 is the host is trying to wing it all the time about everything. Especially, I would notice this when I was working in the studio. Again, I work on more the content strategy now. So sometimes the client comes to me, they're like, well, I feel like I'm not resonating. I feel like I'm not connecting with people. I'm like, how much did you prepare? Or like, did you at least think about the angle of these podcasts? And the person would say, well, not really. Or it's like, oh, I've been working in the industry. I know it. But there's always some things, like I always go from the point of like, what are the takeaways of these episodes? And I make sure that in every single episode that I create, I'm giving you value that I promised in the beginning of the episode, right? So I have a run of the show in bullet points, so I'm not reading, I'm not memorizing everything. Psh, what a joke. My memory is not the best, so I definitely would not be able to release a weekly episode if I was trying to memorize everything or reading from a teleprompter. So I know that I wouldn't be able to do that. So again, I'm not trying to wing it. I prepare for some parts. Other things, I leave it a little more flexible. So trying to wing it, I feel like people say, okay, I'll just show up and do some content and then people are going to love it. And then they don't, and people are like, oh, wah, 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 and they stop podcasting. So number 6 is kind of connected to winging it, and that is not doing any market research ahead of launching. This because some markets are saturated. Some markets are not monetizable. Some markets have too many competitors. And if you're not looking to see what people are doing, and sometimes it's honestly like, some people tell me they never listened to a podcast before launching. They're like, people told me I needed to create a podcast. I don't know what I'm supposed to say. And so the whole journey is riddled with insecurities or just messing up. So launching a podcast without knowing exactly what's the longevity of the theme. Is this going to be a fade very soon? Is a market also can mean like market of listeners and market like investment market? Is this something that is going to be fading away, or there's just not that much interest overall, like the news cycle, quote unquote? So understanding that you can do a very thorough market research with, paying someone to do it, or spending, months and months researching and looking into who is doing it, who are the biggest players, how much money are they investing. Some industries just don't make sense for a quote unquote DIY podcaster to break through the market because it's just going to be really difficult to make. Not impossible, but a lot of people, they feel like there's so much struggle that they don't want to do it. So again, not looking into it is a recipe for disaster. Number 7, only focusing on the fun work. Having a podcast, and if you just want to do it for fun, it's fine. Now, the difference is when people want to have all the fun, but they have aspirations that require like monetization or wanting to grow the podcast and use it as a tool for the business and getting clients, but not wanting to talk to strangers. They just want to talk to their friends. Well, of course, the podcast cannot grow and they're going to run out of interest and run out of money. Some people, they just wanted to do the things that they enjoyed. So maybe, for instance, is having the podcast, but the podcast only be available on podcast platforms and not on their website. So basically, if people are looking for them as a podcast host, like they can't really find it because it's only like maybe on Spotify or whatever. And so, maybe the fun is just creating a lot of social media clips, but there's no purpose in creating that. And there's a big disconnect between the idea of the podcast and what people wanted to do. By the way, check episode 4 on 7 goals you can set for your podcast, and also the podcast basics series that I'm breaking down, like if you want to start a podcast, think about all of these things. So really thinking about like, if you want to just launch a podcast, but you're not titling the podcast like something that people want to listen to or they know what it is, right? If I just said fails on the title of this episode, you'd be like, fails for what? Titling this episode like 10 reasons why most podcasters fail is completely different than just putting like 10 fails or whatever. So again, show notes, same thing. It takes time. It's not fun. You may have to pay someone. And a lot of people who don't want to do all of that, they just like, oh, there's so much work to do. It's not worth it. And sometimes not focusing on the non-fun work means also like people are not planning. And so they're like, I had 10 ideas and that's it. I have no more ideas for these podcasts. Well, that podcast ends up being like everything and anything. So it's really hard to pitch why people should be listening, because these podcasts ends up being something that has just no goal here. Number 8, that idea that publish them and they will come, them being the audience. There's no goals, there's no strategy, there's like not taking the time to think about like, why should they come? I hate this expression because it's so untrue. With social media, with SEO, with websites, with YouTube, that's a different game. But podcast discovery is really hard for most people. You go onto a podcast platform and you're looking for your current podcasts, right? Like you're looking for the same ones that you follow. You may go to YouTube and look for an answer, but like that's not how people discover. And so if your content is not on YouTube, if your content is not discoverable, you may be struggling to be found. And then number 9, the host is stuck in nostalgia or the good old days. And a lot of people get really disheartened about podcasting because maybe they had like really 3 the strongest months you can have. They maybe launched in a really good period. And so sometimes someone launches a show in January, March, July, or October, which are the best months for podcast discovery. And they may think, okay, wow, I'm getting 320 new listeners every week. This is amazing. And then it starts dipping and they go, oh, I'm not interested, this is not going anywhere, and again, not taking long enough, not having clarity on their strategy. And so they're just looking around and they're like, those days were the really good ones, I'm disappointed, this is not worth my time. Maybe they launched the podcast in a time where they didn't have a lot of competitors, or maybe they launched the podcast prior to 2017 when technology was, you didn't have Riverside, you didn't have podcast platforms that really made it super easy to distribute your content, or maybe you didn't have the tools that we have now to do descriptions. And so most people were not interested or had any knowledge of what podcasts was. So a lot of people stop podcasting because they feel disappointed that things are not like they used to be. And so they had podcast sponsorships coming their way, left, right, and center. And now there's a lot of more people. So maybe sponsors are diversifying their podcast hosts and getting their ad dollars somewhere else. So people just get really, really stuck on those like, oh, that was perfect. I don't know what's going on. So let's just stop podcasting, or like nobody's interested in what I have to say, so they just stop podcasting altogether. And this kind of ties in with number 10, which is when hosts are too strict or obsessed with rules and really inflexible. I feel like podcasts, again, if you look at the podcasters who have made it, they stuck with it. They were willing to just learn along the way. They were not kind of giving up easily, and they were willing to put in the time that it required or the money required in order to invest to get to where they are today, right? So I noticed that hosts were very inflexible, and they said, hey, I have to be in the studio with a physical guest. So if they're not coming to me, I'm not interviewing them. Guests who said, hey, I would love to do a virtual interview. And the host said, absolutely not. It's either that or nothing. And it was just a shame because there was a really good partnership that could have happened. It was amazing for the host, but they were just very inflexible in that sense. Another one was that I noticed was that the host feels like they have all the answers. And even though they sometimes are paying for feedback, they're not taking it in because they think they know better in every aspect, right? And I feel like hosts who are like this, maybe they are paying, and this happened before in my journey, where someone was paying me, the producer, to produce a show. And at the end, they were like, I want the final cut. I'm going to be editing the podcast. And I was like, but I thought, the reason why you were paying me, the producer, was to run this for you. And they said, no, I know what's best. Even though I don't know how to edit podcasts, I feel like I want to edit for content-wise, and I just want to make sure that I'm seen in the best light, and blah, 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 blah. Or then I work with another host who they had a whole team, and they just would spend so many hours redoing the work that their assistants were doing because they just couldn't delegate. So these people ended up, both of them, not staying long in the podcast game because, again, the pressure of having to execute on everything, and again, they were running a business as well. So there was just a lot going on, and they were not able to deliver good content constantly, or at least to be top of mind long enough. They just burned out. So it's super disappointing because the content was really good, but they just were not willing to budge. Another situation is that a client had blinders on, but far too long. And so they were like, well, I started the podcast this way, and I don't care what everyone else is doing. I am continuing doing the same. This works when, one, you have, again, proof of concept, and you know it's going to work, and you know that all the other elements are aligned. So, for instance, you know that if you continue doing the podcast in the same format for a specific period of time, it's only a matter of time until the podcast grows, or that you absolutely have confirmed with people who are podcast experts, or that you told them all of your specific circumstances, so they say, okay, I advise you this, stick with it and long enough and you will like eliminate your competition. But I feel like when people go, I just feel like, and sometimes even when they are, again, they never listen to podcasts, but they're like, this is just my vision. I don't care. And then when results don't come in, they just feel like, oh, I maybe recorded, 4 years of podcasting and not a single client has come through. They never looked through the process and said, well, maybe this is not the best format for what my goals are, right? So another one is when people I want the quote unquote right way to do things. So they may be replicating someone who they see on television, who they think, okay, podcasts have to look professional. So I have to sound like a journalist. I have to, right? So they lose the joy in podcasting. Or maybe they feel like they are doing this for someone else, and they are not aligning this, again, self-worth and all of those things sometimes happens where people have to pull the rules to say, this is how you do it. When in reality, podcasting evolves so much, especially the world of content creation evolves really fast. And it's okay, especially being authentic and making mistakes. I do mistakes all the time on this podcast. So just inviting you to think about that. And then one last element on that is that people who are too stuck on how people are supposed to create. I see a lot of podcasters looking around and, at their competitors and saying, so-and-so, they don't have as many years of experience. They shouldn't be creating content. And they get involved in a lot of, me, myself, and I, and just me. And so they end up not benefiting from maybe growing the podcast organically through a cross promotion or through podcast guesting, because they think that they only have, quote unquote, the right credentials or the right expertise. They're saying, I don't care about anyone else. I'm the only person who's the authority. And so unfortunately, a lot of times it just doesn't work out because they're kind of like isolating themselves. And as you know, podcasting is all about collaboration and podcast growth is all about collaboration. Those episodes that I think you should be listening to after this episode, I'm going to be making sure that you do have access to them in the show notes. It's episode 15, 5 phrases to scrap from your vocabulary if you want your podcast to succeed. Episode 22, the first 3 investments every podcaster should prioritize. And then obviously episode number 4, which is covering the 7 podcast goals that you should set for your podcast. And episode 50, 10 podcast marketing strategies to leave behind in 2024. Those episodes are really good continuations of this episode. But just recapping the 10 reasons why most podcasters fail is number 1, the host didn't give enough time to generate podcast momentum. Number 2, they're not investing in areas that they need it the most. Number 3, the opposite. So they're investing too much too soon. Number 4, they're too worried about appealing to everyone but themselves. Number 5, the host is trying to wing it in all possible ways. Number 6, they never did a market research to figure out if this was, something that made sense. Number 7, they only focus on the fun work and not the tasks that actually are gonna help the podcast grow, which sometimes includes having to use tools that cost money or that are doing things that you don't like doing. Number 8, publishing it and they will come. So never setting goals, just saying just me showing up will be enough for podcast listeners to come and to make my show successful. Number 9, the host is stuck in nostalgia or the good old days and they can't see that things have changed. Number 10, the host is too strict, obsessed with rules, inflexible, and not willing to take in feedback. So, I hope that through this year, through the future, you look at these and you identify those that you're like, you know what? I feel like maybe some of these elements are the reasons why I'm so close to giving up podcasting. And I don't want you to be part of the 90% of podcasters who launch a show and never make it to a full year of podcasting to episode 50 because they just pod faded, they got overwhelmed, all of these reasons that I just listed. So if you are a small business owner and your podcast is not growing, if you're not seeing the authority that you need to be seeing, if you're not connecting to the industry leaders that you want to connect and you want to increase your influence, you can work with me on getting that done. The links to work with me will be available in the show notes and also at the podcast space. Cannot invite you enough to talk to me, to follow me on Instagram. I share a lot of stuff behind the scenes, other insightful information about the podcast, things they need to be talking about and thinking about. So in case you haven't, make sure that you follow me at the podcast space. I've been Anne Xavier, and I invite you, as always, to create imperfect content that moves you forward. I'll see you in the next episode.